So for Old English poetry, a quick kind of context, just as far as when and where this poetry was being written, or more accurately, it was spoken and performed a lot more before any of it was written down. The 5th through the 11th century in England tends to be referred to as the early English period or the Anglo-Saxon period. The people themselves referred to themselves as Anglican or English, spelled with an SC instead of an SH. And then at the beginning of this period, the descendants of Germanic tribes, it was the Angles, the Saxons, and everybody forgets about the Jutes. They don't get the rep. They came to England after the fall of Rome, and there were initially separate countries. There was Mercia, there was Northumbria, there was West Sussex, and Wessex rather, and those were eventually combined into England, into a single country. And the year generally where this ends is 1066, both politically and linguistically, because William of Normandy showed up, and no more Anglo-Saxon kings. Now it was Norman kings, and at the same time, the ruling people bring their own language, and a huge influx of French words into the English language, and that was how Old English became Middle English. So when you talk about Old English, you're talking about pre-1066, very Germanic, think not so much Chaucer, but think Beowulf. And then Middle English comes after that. And I mean, like everything else, William didn't land and, show up and now everyone is speaking this different form of English. It comes, there's a lot of gradualness to it. Like there will be some things written earlier or later that have different characteristics of more Old English or more Middle English. And Old English poetry, the thing that I like about Old English poetry, and the thing that is very different from a lot of modern English poetry, is it's not free verse, but it's also not a strict meter. You've got each line is divided up into a half line, and each of those half lines has 2 stressed syllables. And then you get 2 groups of unstressed syllables per line. Usually each group has a syllable or 2. So like in the, or of the, or at the is going to be a group of unstressed syllables. Just like of or for, maybe without a the or an would be its own little group of unstressed syllables. And rather than rhyme, you have alliteration. One or both of the stressed syllables in that first half line alliterates with the first stressed syllable in the second half line. So the rules for alliteration are a little bit different than a lot of modern poetry. I think because modernly we're such a literate culture, we're very focused on how things look on the page, whether that matches how they sound, and that becomes more important than like the stresses. We also have, like we talked about earlier, this is before English got a whole pile of French vocabulary, and way before English became the language that, beats up other languages and rifles through their pockets for loose words. English was very, very Germanic, very kind of singular vocabulary, so the pronunciation rules tended to be very similar. Everything tended to be emphasized the first syllable of the word, unless it was like a prefix. Modern English, you have a lot different stresses. So what happens is, fighting forever, modernly that would alliterate. You look at it on the page, you're like, okay, 2 F's, they both make that F sound, must be alliteration. But because that 4 is functioning more like a prefix or like an unstressed syllable, that's not how it would work in that Old English poetry style. But finding misfortune visually doesn't alliterate. You've got an F and an M, but again, that miss, it's not a stressed syllable. So finding misfortune would alliterate. So finding misfortune could be an example of a half line, And then to finish that line off, you would then need another half line where the first stress is going to alliterate with that F, and then the second one is not. The other thing where there's some weirdness and some nuance is different vowel sounds are considered to alliterate with each other. Like modernly, we would think of axes and apples as alliteration. But you could also do axes and elders or axes and ice cream. I think it's more common from what I've seen to alliterate vowels with their own sounds, but they can be alliterated with any other vowel. And I've also seen sources differ on what counts as far as consonant blends. Like, can I alliterate spite with stop, or do I have to alliterate storm with stop? So, and I think, like with a lot of poetry, like modern poetry, if you're writing a sonnet, your iambic pentameter does not have to be exactly perfect. There might be a spot here where, well, it isn't quite, but it works. Or your rhyme, okay, so yes, this one here is a near rhyme, but it was the exact visual image you wanted, so you went with it. Or, okay, yeah, we got a rhyme by repeating the same word, but we used it in a different sense. It works, it flows. The Old English poetry, a lot of that too, it wasn't, especially because a lot of this was, this was spoken and performed. It's not so much, okay, I'm writing this as a graded composition and my English teacher is going to take a red pen and I will be in trouble if I have not gotten these rules of alliteration right. So, and does anybody have any questions, thoughts, or comments before we go on into meter? Because I know we're the last class of the day, and if people are just falling asleep face down on their keyboards, I want to give you a little bit of a breath before we keep going.
So could the length of the line, first half of the line, be something specific?
It's based on having two stressed syllables and then two groups of unstressed syllables. So like Quatwe Gardena and Gerdigom, etc. If you look at like the Beowulf as an example, your line length, your half line length isn't exact, but you've got a couple of stresses and a couple of unstressed syllable like groups that are usually a syllable or two. Does that answer the question?
Oh, kind of like the Greek.
Not familiar with Greek's poetry, so I'll take your word for it. How does that work as far as
sure, you get the long, short, short, long, short, short.
Yeah. And there was differentiation between that I don't really go into in this class because I haven't fully wrapped my head around it. But they did pay attention to like whether you had long or short vowels and like actually, spoken out longer rather than what we think of as a short and long vowel that are different sounds. So that kind of plays into the meter too. It's not a distinction that exists in modern English, so I'm still kind of trying to figure out how that really does work. Any questions? Any other questions or comments? So one of the things, like, because there's not tons and tons of surviving written material, like from this period, we do not have the alliterative poetry textbook where somebody said, okay, here's how you do it. Here's how the meter works. Here's what alliterates with what. We're kind of like back figuring out these rules based on observation and probably also from comparison because the Norse forms are simpler, but, not simpler, similar, but actually much more complicated. Like in Norse poetry, you will have these very complex kennings that are little puzzles in themselves. But one of the things where there's some debate is on meter, because it's hard to tell, because the meter is irregular, it's hard to tell exactly what the rules are. 19th century, Edward Sievers identified 5 stress patterns and lettered them A to E based on how often they're used. And in the bibliography, I've got the website listed. Daniel O'Donnell has a really useful poem for keeping the subtypes straight. And when I'm writing, one of the things that I will do is like, okay, I want to have this half line. Is it one of those Sievers types? Like, does it fit? So the poem is Anna angry and Britnoth bold, in keen conflict, drove Don backwards, each one with edge. And I mean, if this were an actual Anglo-Saxon poem, those are all half lines. Like, they would all have something else as the second part of that line that would finish that alliteration. But you can see the stressed syllables alliterate, and the stress pattern, there are 5 different stress patterns depending on, do we start with a stress or do we start with an unstressed and have more of an iambic thing? Do we have our stresses in the middle? Do we have our stresses clumped up at the beginning? And do we have any kind of secondary stresses? On the handout, the bolds are the main stress, and then if it's italic, it's kind of a secondary stress. And then that tells you what Sievers type it is, A, B, C, D, or E, because those alliterating sounds match up. The thing that I love probably the most about Anglo-Saxon verse and Old English verse is the kennings. Basically, any metaphorical renaming where you're describing an object in a metaphorical way or kind of a sideways, different way. And what really is nice for that in alliterative verse, a lot of the time you will want, it's like, okay, I want a word for king, but I can't use king because I'm not alliterating on K. I started this line with R's. So, okay, great, he's a ring giver. I started it with F's. He's a friend lord. So, and like, there were common locations and themes and objects that would have a ton of different kennings. So, you know, you might go through Beowulf and they would refer to a sword 5 different ways, just depending on which of those words fits the alliteration. And sometimes are we emphasizing a particular thing? Like, if we're talking about how great this king is and, oh, he's generous, you know, he gives all of his followers gold, and, you know, maybe we're going to refer to him as a ring giver to emphasize that, versus maybe use something different if we're talking more about his prowess in battle. Or, you know, if he's not a great king, maybe we won't use those metaphors. And something like 1/3 of the words in Beowulf are kennings. And like, one of the cool things that this does, because this is such a like short, you've got very short little half lines, you're kind of ending up having to pack a lot of meaning into a few words. Sometimes using those compound words helps with that. And like, one thing that I think is cool is the name Beowulf itself is a kenning, a bee wolf, or, you know, something that attacks a beehive and tears it up, or a bear. So Beowulf is this big bear of a person who, you know, rips arms off monsters and fights sea monsters. So, as a little break from listening to me talk, since we're talking about kennings, one of the things that can be fun to kind of play around with is coming up with kennings for objects or for things. So folks would like to come up with a kenning for, let's say, a book. See if you can come up with a kenning for a book and either shout it out or throw it in the chat. Printed universe, I like that. Story bound. Cool. Yeah, or a bound story if you wanted to make it more work as a noun. Buried treasure. Yeah, absolutely. That works. Memory keeper. Yep, that's a good one. Okay. Word picture, knowledge holder. Yep, those are good. So let's try another one. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So let's do one more and then we will move on. What would you use as a kenning for river? Water trail. Aqua snake, swimway, yep. Boat path, yep. Fluid path. Yep. And you can kind of see as we're coming up with these how that helps, how using kennings can help with writing border waves. Crop flutter, yep, that's a good one. Because you have a whole bunch of different lengths of syllables, different stresses, and different starting letters, so different starting sounds, so different alliteration. So you can kind of work with that. And a lot of, let's see, one other thing that they used a lot in the Anglo-Saxon verse is, and I might be mispronouncing it, I think it's pronounced litotes, don't quote me on this. Basically, it's an ironic understatement where you're using a negative to emphasize a positive. Modernly, we don't see it as much, but it does tend to come up if people are being a little bit wry or a little bit sarcastic, particularly about something bad. Like, for example, if you were to say that some movie star, some model is not bad looking, meaning that they're handsome or they're drop dead gorgeous, that would be that ironic understatement. And one thing that is commonly used where you can really see kind of that irony, if you ask me how my day went, and I say, well, let's just say it didn't go according to plan, you're not going to picture like a little diversion from the plan. You're not going to be like, oh, well, I forgot to stop for coffee. You're going to picture, did I get in a car accident? Was I in traffic for 3 hours? Did I lose my job? Did something catch fire? Because I'm doing this very, very understated way of talking that kind of hints at, oh, it was really bad. And one example of this, using that kind of understatement, it's in Juliana, which is a poem in the Exeter book. Juliana was this martyred saint. They were very big on virgin martyrs. There's a lot of saints' lives. I think there's a couple or a few in the Exeter book. And her father has got this marriage set up, and she's like, no, I'm going to be a virgin. And he freaks out. And the line is, then her fiendly father replied to her in rage, and he was not promising her ornaments. That he was not promising her ornaments is a very kind of ironic, kind of understated way of saying he absolutely went off the deep end. Not only was he not promising her gifts and shiny things, he was ranting and raving and, potentially threatening her. So before we move on, would folks like to try to come up with some of those ironic understatements, like a litotes, and it could be about it. Like, I'm not going to give you a topic. It could be about anything. Like, what might be a phrase where you would throw in some ironic understatement? Oh, yes. Definitely not the sharpest tool in the box is absolutely an example of this. Any of those, not the most pleasant individual, not the cloudiest day. Oh. And just like there's some sort of, I like this example of not the sharpest tool in the box because it's kind of a set format. Yeah, brave Sir Robin. It's kind of a set format for criticizing somebody. You're not the brightest bulb in the drawer, not the sharpest tool in the box, not the spiciest pepper in the taco. You can make up all kinds of random ones based on that theme. And Old English poetry kind of does some similar things, both with that ironic understatement and just in general, not the most popular book in the library. I feel like that. Where you'll have phrases like, waxed under welcome or grew under heaven. And, that's like a set phrase. And you could, other verbs end up in there with that W alliteration. So a lot of the time you've got a whole bunch of different common kennings for common things like the sea or swords or battle. And you've got some kind of standard alliterative phrases, like sort of the way Homer, you're like, oh, yeah, wine, dark sea. Okay, great. You have some of those similar things come in. Like it's a different vocabulary, but it's doing the same kind of thing. So, So as far as themes, the most common, most well-known Old English poem is Beowulf. And you have this mythical kind of legendary story with a lot of battles. And the narrative structure is kind of different from what you might be used to modernly. And a lot of medieval things do that. You don't necessarily have this, okay, we've got some, exposition and we've got rising action and, a climax and falling action. A lot of the more narrative poetry is, yep, some stuff happened. Maybe it was a battle, maybe it was a falling out between people, somebody's lord died and now he's wandering exiled. But you don't tend to have this really exact kind of narrative structure. And you got a lot of, it's kind of interesting because you have this a lot of pre-Christian stories and ideas being written down after the conversion by Christian monks. And so sometimes it's hard to tell, well, okay, was this the way this was before, or was this a little editorializing? What got changed? They wrote a lot of religious topics. There were saints' lives. There's this really trippy and really interesting poem called The Dream of the Rood, where this person has this dream where they see a vision of the cross decked out in gold and jewels, and the cross talks to them about the crucifixion, and it's kind of wild. And the talking object thing kind of shows up also in the riddles. In the Exeter book, there's all these riddles, just little fun word games of, I'm going to describe this thing in the weirdest, most outlandish way possible, and maybe with some misleading clues, and then I'm going to try to, see if you can guess what it is. And the fun thing with that is there's not an answer key, so people kind of debate, okay, well, what really is this? But a lot of the time you have the objects personified, like a book or a sword or a chainmail shirt is talking to you and telling you, okay, I'm this, but I'm not that, and can you guess my name? And there's a lot of early English, especially I think with the Viking invasions, with kind of being in a precarious position, their outlook on life was not warm and sunny and happy. There was very much the sense that, okay, the Roman Empire was here and they left and they had these baths and these, you know, great buildings and all of this tile and all this nice stuff, and we don't really have any of that. And, you know, there's all kinds of chaos and upheaval. And it was one of those times that people kind of felt like we were at the end of the world. So there's a lot of talk about poetry dealing with loss and isolation and exile, and sort of some depressing, everything is terrible kinds of themes tend to come up. So any questions or any comments or any? Okay, so I have a couple of examples. The prologue to Beowulf is probably like the most famous bit of Old English poetry. And I'm going to read it in the modern English translation. I basically know the pronunciation rules for Old English, but I don't quite want to butcher it. So, for Beowulf, listen, we of the Spear Danes in days of yore, of those folk kings the glory have heard, how those noblemen brave things did, often Shield, son of Shef, from enemy hosts, from many people mead benches took, terrorized warriors. After first he was helpless found, he knew the recompense for that. Grew under sky, and that's that little set phrase I was telling you about, Wex under Wolknum. In honors thrived, until to him each of the neighboring tribes over the whale road had to submit, tribute yield. That was a good king. And one of the cool things when you look at the Old English, like there's points where the vocabulary is nothing resembling modern English. But then you look at a sentence like that was good Könning, like you could tell that was a good king. Like you're missing an article, your pronunciation's a little different, but it's right there. So, the next little example I have, we talked about the riddles, and those were from the viewpoint of an object or of a thing, and the game is to try to kind of guess what it is. So as I'm reading this, see if you can guess, and it's one of those, the first thing that you're thinking is probably not that, and it's intended to make you think the wrong answer. It's messing with you a little bit, and you'll kind of see what I mean. So the riddle goes, I am wonderful help to women, the hope of something to come. I harm no citizen except my slayer. Rooted, I stand on a high bed. I am shaggy below. Sometimes the beautiful peasant's daughter, an eager-armed, proud woman, grabs my body, brushes my red skin, holds me hard, claims my head. The curly-haired woman who catches me fast will feel our meeting. Her eye will be wet. So, in chat or out loud, what do you think that is? Yep, onions. Oh. It's rooted on a high bed. And your eye will be wet because onions make you cry. And there are actually, like, in the Exeter book, there are 3 or 4 riddles that are just designed to make you go, oh, are we talking about something dirty? Oh no, it's a key, or oh no, it's an onion. And then there's one that it's like, no, that's really what they're talking about. And I feel like this had to be this elaborate joke. Like, I picture the monks sitting around telling each other these riddles, and, you know, they're like, oh, this one's sexual. No, it's not. It's an onion. And then, like, nope, this one, there's nothing else. It's just a dirty joke. So, you know, this is apparently what you do when you're in a monastery all day. So we have, it looks like we've got probably 25 minutes left. I must have run through that very fast. So does anybody have questions? Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
The basically splitting between the first half and the second half of the line, is there any type of pause there, or is the pause just the grammatical pauses which are written, the commas, periods, things like that?
You see, that, like, I don't know. Like, I think that, because, like, you can tell, I mean, like, in the first bit of Beowulf, like, they seem kind of like, usually it's a phrase. Like, usually it's set up so that as you're speaking it, there could naturally be a pause. I don't necessarily think there has to be. And none of this was written with pronunciation, and the half lines weren't marked. That's kind of, back figuring out, piecing together from the written examples what this was supposed to work like. So that's a good question that I don't have the answer to.
Was any of the punctuation marked in period, or was it completely punctuationless?
I think it was completely punctuationless. I would have to double check that, but well, actually, let me look real quick. Because Beowulf starts with "what," which is an exclamation, so. See if I can just share real quick. Like, okay, so it looks like there are periods and I think those periods are more end of sentence than a half line. Because oft-shield schluffing is a half line, and that, well, it's hard to tell because this one's a little bit, this is, I think, one of the copies that got burned in a library fire. But, like, you can see where there's some periods or some dots. So there might be, like, I think there might be some marking. But I'm not 100% certain if that's more the end of a sentence, or if that's more if it's marking half lines. Like, usually, I mean, it's pretty much, it is like all run together. You can see that there aren't like line breaks. So does that, I guess it doesn't fully answer your question, but kind of as much as I can tell. Oh, and in the chat. Okay. Is there really no number of syllables for this first and second part of the phrase line? Is there a rule to count the number of syllables for the following line? Hard to wrap my head around how few rules there are other than the alliteration rule. So basically, there's no number of syllables, but there's a set number of stresses. So it's not exact, but it's also not infinite. Like, you're going to have, if we go back up to like the Sievers types, you're going to have in each half line, you're going to have 2 stressed syllables, and then you're going to have 2 either you'll have 2 unstressed syllables, or you'll have 2 groups of unstressed syllables that might actually be a couple syllables each. like, you don't, I'm trying to think of a phrase that would have 3 unstressed syllables, like maybe on the first day, but like I think that's about as far as you could get. And so I think, like, realistically, you're looking at a half line being a minimum of 4 syllables, probably not any more than 7. I feel like 7 or 8 would be hard to come up with. But yeah, it's also, like, it is definitely hard to tell what rules are real rules and what rules kind of look like rules. Like, for things like alliteration, can you alliterate with a consonant blend? It's always tough to tell looking at an existing poem. Okay, did they do this, if 99 times out of 100 they do it this way? Is the 1 out of 100 wrong, or something that they, figured was close enough? It makes it a little tricky. But yeah, as long as there are 2 stressed syllables on each half line, there's 2 stressed syllables, and then there's two groups of unstressed. You end up either having 2 groups of unstressed that are separated, or you could have 2, or they're together with like a kind of a secondary stress, like in drove Don backwards, each one with edge. And yeah, it is very free and loose, and kind of that's one of the things that I like about it. But one of the things that's really hard about it, if I'm trying to write in this style, I will find myself doing type B, type B, type B, type B, and then have to go, no, those are iambs. That's not right. If I want to do that, I should be writing a sonnet, and then actually rewrite stuff so that it's variable. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely runes, and definitely like the Latin alphabet, like there were, like the thorn and the F, where you had, okay, these aren't letters. Okay, can you talk a little about how to write this in modern English? There are kind of different ways to do it. Basically, the way that I tend to do it is work at like the half line, kind of go a line at a time, and try to minimize filler words and kind of have the word order a little bit looser. Because one of the things about Old English, languages a lot of the time tend to get simpler over time. So Old English had tons of word endings and different word forms that you could look at a noun and go, okay, this is a subject, and if it's different, if it's done differently, this is a verb. And the only thing that we really keep of that is pronouns. Like, how in Latin there's declensions, which I believe that's the right term. Like, you have a different noun form depending on what it's doing in the sentence. Pronouns, Old English used to work that way. Pronouns in modern English still do. Like, you wouldn't say him went to the store, you would say he went to the store. In Old English, you'd actually have a different version of him. Is this the object, or is this helped by or done to? There were, I think, 4 different cases. So because of that, the word order is a little more fluid. English, we usually do subject, verb, object, and to try to keep some of the feel, sometimes go, well, okay, object, verb, subject, to him gave a sword is something you might use rather than, gave a sword to him, just to kind of change things up a little bit. And I've seen like, depending on what you're writing and how you want to do it, you can either kind of go line by line, one thing at a time, and, you know, figure it out. Or you can go, okay, I've got a topic. Maybe I'm writing about my baronage, or maybe I'm writing about a historical event. So let me come up with a whole bunch of kennings on that topic. You know, what would be a good kenning to describe my baroness? Let me come up with like 6 of those. And what would be a good kenning for my baron? Let me come up with a few of those. And you just kind of have this list of ideas, and maybe come up with the alliterative phrases, the lightities, the ironic understatements, and kind of like work from that. And then those are sort of your puzzle pieces. And then you can go, okay, now I need to turn this into something coherent. What goes where? What alliterates with what? Which pieces can I use? And we actually did, the earlier class that I did, we kind of did that. We did a poem about the isolation of COVID and doing university, the whole kind of light of knowledge in the dark of this plague, and being able to start doing events in person and coming back together again. And so we kind of had this whiteboard set up with like just the random ideas off to one side, and then as we found places for them, we could fill them in. Does that answer the question? Okay, and then Paganis, the 14 pages of Beowulf. Awesome, thank you. Okay. So does anybody have any other questions, comments? I think technically we are supposed to be done at 6:20 because we started at 5:30. It's a 50-minute hour, but there's also not a class after this. So if people are ready to be done and eat dinner, please feel free to run away. Thank you so much for attending. It's really cool to have people from all over the known world talking about poetry together in a space. And if anybody does have other questions, comments, random thoughts, and yeah, thanks, Sophia. Feel free to. Yes. Yep, same here. BA in English. You're very welcome.
Thank you. This was very fun.
Cool. I'm very glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you all very much for attending. I am going to. Awesome. Hextilda, I look forward to reading or hearing performed your poems in this style. That would be fantastic. And thank you all again. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you all again for coming. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope you had a good university today.
Beautiful class.
Well,
Thanks a million, Adriana. Thanks for your teaching and sharing with everybody. I'm going to close down the recording, and then you'll be able to see it on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you.